friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 19 of our read along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Today is the first day of the last week of our read along of Roughing It. We've got just 4 more days to conclude our read along of this lovely story. And you might be wondering, what will we read next? Well, the members of our group have voted, and unless things have changed drastically in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to assume they haven't, our winner by 2 votes over the next 2 other books, which also were tied for 4 votes each, with 6 votes each, our winner for the next book that we'll read together is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. So we returned to our beginnings. We started this book group with a read-along together of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Our next book will be Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, the second of the Bronte sisters. And so you'll get to make your own decision as to whether you're more of an Emily or a Charlotte reader. I gotta say, in the past, I've always preferred Charlotte's Jane Eyre over Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. But then, whenever I pick up Wuthering Heights, which has happened to me several times over the years, I cannot put it down, and I love it too. So, well, for those of you who did read Jane Eyre with me, I hope that, or if you've read it on your own some other time, and you have not yet it's hard to say read Wuthering Heights next to each other. It's like a tongue twister. If you have not yet read Wuthering Heights, then you'll get to make your own decision as to whether you're more in the Emily or Charlotte camp. So that will be our next read along together. We will start this next week on Tuesday, and on Monday of next week we will have our tea party. I'll go ahead and set that up today. And so if you'd like to come celebrate and talk about Roughing It with some other members of our group, it won't just me talking /with you like through this format that we do on through the Zoom or through the Facebook Live, where you can comment and I can read back, respond back to that, but I can't actually hear your voices and you can't directly interact the way we could in a more interactive forum. So if you would like to do that, we'll be having a tea party next Monday at 3 o'clock, our usual time, where we can actually discuss, like you can share your thoughts and you can talk about the questions that have been bothering you or just like exciting you as we've read Roughing It by Mark Twain, and we can really dialogue with each other. So that'll be next Monday on the 26th at 3 o'clock in our usual time. So we've got 4 more days of reading Roughing It though, so let's see what other thoughts it sparks. We had a big change last week. On Thursday, Mark Twain left California and went to Hawaii, so hard to blame him. I think most of us would love to just take off and go to Hawaii, even though we love California. I love California, but Hawaii, magic. All right, so let's talk about tea also. I was just emptying out the basket of my tea leaves. For those of you who have been reading with me in the past week, you might have remembered that I attended a workshop on tea previous Saturday, and since then I've been sharing each of the teas that I got to sample during that workshop and been talking with you about them. So the next tea that we had in our progression from light to dark teas, on Thursday last week I had that dark rose, which was sort of a take on a pu'er tea. And this tea today is another kind of pu'er tea. By the way, the gentleman who was hosting the workshop said pu'er, which he said is spelled P-U-E-R, although sometimes it does have an H also. He said the way to remember it is think of Winnie the Pooh breathing. So pu'er, but you're supposed to think of Winnie the Pooh. So pu'er tea. And so this one that I'm having is a 2019 Mrs. Zhao's Sheng Pu'er. And he said this handmade Sheng Pu'er tea showcases Ms. Zhao's, abilities as a tea maker. The light, complex, vegetal quality of the cup is accented by notes of juniper and citrus rind, and the ingredients are only pu'er tea. What I wanted to point out, let me show you, I'm going to actually open this up really quick and show you one of the little bits, is that this particular tea, again, we've had such a variety in how these teas appear. And again, they're all the exact same leaf. We had the little oolong that was rolled into a ball. This one is dried and it looks like it's rolled into little sticks. And then again, as it steeps, the leaves rehydrate and again spread out into these big, beautiful, full tea leaves. And so it's just kind of amazing how the same plant not only becomes different teas in, and how we drink them and the flavoring that we get, but based on the oxidation and where it grows, the soil, the how they choose to dry it and everything, but even the shapes that it dries into and how that can affect the taste of the tea. Because he was saying like it was some, like he mentioned with the oolong that we had rolled into little balls, that it can even, you really should drink it on multiple steeps so you can get the different flavors as the leaves blossom. Really neat. So this tea is, let's see, what are the fun informational bits about this? He did point out that a dark tea like we had on Thursday differs from a proper pu'er, and that is basically it's a pu'er, but it is, a pu'er must be grown in the Yunnan province of China, which is the most southwest province, in order for it to have the pu'er name. Much like champagne must be grown in, the grapes must be grown in the Champagne region of France in order to properly be called a champagne and not a sparkling wine. So this is a proper pu'er, harvested by Ms. Zhao, and has a really nice smell to it. Smells to me more like a green than a black tea, so I think it's kind of closer to that. But again, he called this a dark tea, but this is a rather light looking dark tea, but it is in the dark tea family. Still very hot. I also noticed this one was called a Sheng pu'er, and he said that Sheng means it was aged naturally or raw, that the leaves, because these leaves, they have some microbial activity, so there's still a little bit of life to them, if you will, and that, again, like a yogurt, so they do have some natural microbes still alive on them, basically. And that he said the Sheng pu'er ages naturally, but there's another kind called Shu pu'er, and that's spelled S-H-U. The Shu pu'er mimics the natural aging process, but is done much faster. And I didn't write on my notes about the timetable, but I think he said like in 60 days you can do it, would naturally take about 6 months. I think that was about the timeline he said of the Sheng versus the Shu pu'ers. So this is a Sheng pu'er, so it was naturally aged. Yeah, the flavor reminds me of a green tea more than a black tea. It is lovely though. That's very nice. It's not bitter at all. It's very smooth. I think that's sometimes, it's like with coffee. Sometimes you can talk about having a bitter coffee or not. He was saying that these are very smooth teas, and that, actually he was saying the Shu pu'ers can be stronger. He said strong like coffee, but without the bitterness. Ah, that's right. I remember I wrote that down because my guy likes to drink coffee, but he doesn't like the bitterness sometimes. And so he's always searching for the kind, like different brews of coffee that won't be too bitter. And I was like, we should try Shu pu'ers because maybe you might like that. He's more of a coffee and I'm more of a tea, but I'm going to try the Shu pu'er and see if I can turn him to the tea side. That is delicious. Okay. But let's get to our book because we've only got 4 days of reading and I don't want to stall and have us not get through our 4 days of reading. Exciting though the tea is. All right, so let's talk about what we read on Thursday. We read chapters 66 to 68, and I did not move my bookmarks, so that'll be fun. Let's see. So chapter 66 to 68. So where we had ended on Wednesday was that he had just traveled to the Sandwich Islands, which we now usually call Hawaii. And so he goes there and he talks a bit about, he starts out by talking about the native Hawaiians. Let's see, he talks about how they look, how their clothing, let's see. Wait a second. Now I'm confused. 66 to 68. Oh, wait. No, sorry. Now I got myself confused. I'm like, I had moved my bookmarks. I'm like, that does not sound familiar to me. That's because that's what we're reading today. Sorry about that. Let me go back. I had marked it properly, and now I have to remove my bookmarks to get back. So we ended on Thursday with 62 to 65. Sorry about that, friends. I was like, that just didn't look right. Okay, yeah, this is much better. Okay, so, sorry. I see Judy's comment about pu'er, but I'm afraid to touch my screen to get the bottom of the comment. But I see that she also has recommended a pu'er tea as being closer to like a coffee, something stronger. So I will look forward to seeing the rest of that comment, Judy. I hope that it worked out well for you, and I hope my guy also will like the choux pu'er. And if you have a recommendation as a particular one to try, that's a whole new world to me. So I would love to know what would be a good choux pu'er for somebody who likes coffee to try to transition them over to tea. But okay, let's talk about chapters 62 to 65. Here we go. So he was still in San Francisco. There we go. And he decides to go take an assignment writing about the Sandwich Islands in Hawaii. There we go. So Mark Twain, he goes and he's on the ship. He tells a long story about some of the folks he meets on the ship. There's a gentleman named nicknamed the Admiral, who tells these kind of stretches a few stories, and there's another gentleman who finally figures out how to best him by, when the Admiral starts making up facts, this other gentleman says, "Why, yes, you are absolutely correct. And along those lines, you know that was connected to this," and then he makes his own facts up. But because he ties it to what the Admiral first said, the Admiral doesn't feel comfortable refuting him. And so because he's not challenging him on his facts, he's just adding on to the story. And so the gentleman rousts the Admiral in this way because he can't fight back with him. Okay, so then he arrives in Hawaii and he gets over to Honolulu. And it's kind of neat too, because he talks about how, again, for anyone who's been to Hawaii, he talks about how it contained between 12 and 15,000 inhabitants spread out across the entire area. I mean, I guess you could say the same thing when he gives his description of San Francisco and how much it's changed. And when he gives his description of Nevada and how much it's changed, all of these places he's talking about, you read about the description of how these spots were back in the mid-1860s, in 1863 or 1864, and it's just sort of stunning to think about how much they've changed in that time. Like, you know, when you go and see them now, and it's like, oh, there could be like 1,500 people, 12 to 15,000 inhabitants in a tiny little area, not over the entire city. It's sort of remarkable. But he talks about Honolulu. He talks about how it's a beautiful, beautiful place, and then it's perfect. It's like paradise, and then, you know, then you get the first bug bite, and then the next scorpion bite, and then, you know, just there's little bits. Let's see. He also writes about going out and riding a certain horse. Goes out to see some different areas. He sees some ruins. But he also talks too about how the missionaries have changed things from the savage times when there was a king on Oahu and a king in King Kamehameha who searched out the king of Oahu and like conquered the area. And, you know, how the missionaries have changed things, that they have clothed them, educated them, broken up the tyrannous authority of their chiefs, and given them freedom and the right to enjoy whatever their hands and brains produce, with equal laws for all and punishment for all alike who transgress them. And the contrast is so strong, the benefit conferred upon this people by the missionaries is so prominent, so palpable, and so unquestionable, that the frankest compliment I can say them, or pay them, is simply to point to the condition of the Sandwich Islanders of Captain Cook's time and their condition today. Sorry, what I didn't quite get to was, it made it sound like in the thing, like how he was saying how, although these times might be looked down as by a modern person as sort of like, oh, that was the savage era, that this was a time when the people had, in many ways, more freedom, and they were not hungry, they were not told that they were ignorant, they were free, that it was a more blissful place. How sad it is to think of the multitudes who have gone to their graves in this beautiful island and never knew that there was a hell. So before they were educated by the missionaries, they didn't know that there was more to fear, that they didn't know that they needed to work in order to earn their food, because they were able just to share with each other and to partake of the bounty that was about them. And so, sorry, that was the point that he was leading up to with that line about the work that's been done speaks for itself, is that this almost Edenic, is that the proper pronunciation? Like, you know, like an Eden that was out there, like this beautiful utopia, had been changed to be like the rest of the world. In chapter 65, he talks about, we halted on the summit, there was a beautiful view. Talks about a place to listen. He had his horse Oahu again. He was talking about the horse, and he was saying how it's difficult to hire a horse there, and that you kind of get like the not good horses. That they were saying that that they like to kind of swindle you a little bit with the horses when you're a visitor. And so thus ended the chapter. All right, now here we go. I did mark the spots. Okay, so we are going to read chapters 66 to 68 today. Only 3 chapters. So hopefully it's not too terrible and I got myself lost a little in the pages. All right, so let's go ahead and read our 3 chapters together. If you have a tea, please go ahead. Take some time to enjoy a good sip of it. We've got some lovely reading ahead of us. Okay. Today, as I said, we're going to read chapters 66 through 68 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 66. Passing through the marketplace, we saw that feature of Honolulu under its most favorable auspices. That is, in the full glory of Saturday afternoon, which is a festive day with the natives. The native girls by 2s and 3s and parties of a dozen, and sometimes in whole platoons and companies, went cantering up and down the neighboring streets astride of fleet but homely horses, and with their gaudy riding habits streaming like banners behind them. Such a troop of free and easy riders in their natural home. The saddle makes a gay and graceful spectacle. The riding habit I speak of is simply a long, broad scarf, like a tavern tablecloth brilliantly colored, wrapped around the loins once, then apparently passed between the limbs, and each end thrown backward over the same, and floating and flapping behind on both sides beyond the horse's tail, like a couple of fancy flags. Then, slipping the stirrup irons between her toes, the girl throws her chest forward, sits up like a major general, and goes sweeping by like the wind. The girls put on all the finery they can on Saturday afternoon, fine black silk robes, flowing red ones that nearly put your eyes out, others as white as snow, still others that discount the rainbow. And they wear their hair in nets and trim their jaunty hats with fresh flowers and encircle their dusky throats with homemade necklaces of the brilliant vermilion-tinted blossoms of the ohia. And they fill the markets and the adjacent streets with their bright presences and smell like a rag factory on fire with their offensive coconut oil. Occasionally, you see a heathen from the sunny isles away down in the South Seas, with his face and neck tattooed till he looks like a customary mendicant from Washoe who has been blown up in a mine. Some are tattooed a dead blue color down to the upper lip, masked as it were, leaving the natural light yellow skin of Micronesia unstained from thence down. Some with broad marks drawn down from hair to neck on both sides of the face, and a strip of the original yellow skin, 2 inches wide down the center, a gridiron with a spoke broken out. And some with the entire face discolored with the popular mortification tint, relieved only by 1 or 2 thin, wavy threads of natural yellow running across the face from ear to ear, and eyes twinkling out of this darkness from under shadowing hat brims, like stars in the dark of the moon. Sorry. This is the picture of the Sandwich Island girls. You can see the dress he was talking about at the start of the chapter. Moving among the stirring crowds, you come to the poi merchants, squatting in the shade on their hams in true native fashion and surrounded by purchasers. The Sandwich Islanders always squat on their hams, and who knows but they may be the original ham sandwiches. The thought is pregnant with interest. The poi looks like common flour paste and is kept in large bowls formed of a species of gourd and capable of holding from 1 to 3 or 4 gallons. Poi is the chief article of food among the natives and is prepared from the taro plant. The taro root looks like a thick, or if you please, a corpulent sweet potato in shape, but is of a light purple color when boiled. When boiled, it answers as a passable substitute for bread. The buck Kanakas bake it underground, then mash it up well with a heavy lava pestle, mix water with it until it becomes a paste, set it aside and let it ferment, and then it is poi. And an unseductive mixture it is, almost tasteless before it ferments, and too sour for a luxury afterward. But nothing is more nutritious. When solely used, however, it produces acrid humors, a fact which sufficiently accounts for the humorous character of the Kanakas. I think there must be as much of a knack in handling poi as there is in eating with chopsticks. The forefinger is thrust into the mess and stirred quickly round several times and drawn as quickly out, thickly coated, just as if it were poulticed. The head is thrown back, the finger inserted in the mouth, and the delicacy stripped off and swallowed, the eye closing gently meanwhile in a languid sort of ecstasy. Many a different finger goes into the same bowl, and many a different kind of dirt and shade and quality of flavor is added to the virtues of its contents. Around a small shanty was collected a crowd of natives buying the awa root. It is said that but for the use of this root, the destruction of the people in former times by certain imported diseases would have been far greater than it was, and by others it is said that this is merely a fancy. All agree that poi will rejuvenate a man who is used up and his vitality almost annihilated by hard drinking, and that in some kinds of diseases it will restore health after all medicines have failed. But all are not willing to allow to the awa the virtues claimed for it. The natives manufacture an intoxicating drink from it which is fearful in its effects when persistently indulged in. It covers the body with dry white scales, inflames the eyes, and causes premature decrepitude. Although the man before whose establishment we stopped has to pay a government license of $800 a year for the exclusive right to sell awa root, it is said that he makes a small fortune every 12 months, while saloon keepers, who pay $1,000 a year for the privilege of retailing whiskey, only make a bare living. We found the fish market crowded, for the native is very fond of fish and eats the article raw and alive. Let us change the subject. In old times, here Saturday was a grand gala day indeed. All the native population of the town forsook their labors, and those of the surrounding country journeyed to the city. Then the white folks had to stay indoors, for every street was so packed with charging cavaliers and cavalieresses that it was next to impossible to thread one's way through the cavalcades without getting crippled. At night they feasted, and the girls danced the lascivious Hula Dance, a dance that is said to exhibit the very perfection of educated motion of limb and arm, hand, head, and body, and the exactest uniformity of movement and accuracy of time. It is performed by a circle of girls with no raiment on them to speak of, who went through an infinite variety of motions and figures without prompting. And yet so true was their time, and in such perfect concert did they move, that when they were placed in a straight line, hands, arms, bodies, limbs, and heads waved, swayed, gesticulated, bowed, stooped, whirled, squirmed, twisted, and undulated as if they were part and parcel of a single individual. And it was difficult to believe they were not moved in a body by some exquisite piece of mechanism. Of late years, however, Saturday has lost most of its quondam gala features. This weekly stampede of the natives interfered too much with labor in the interests of the white folks, and by sticking in a law here and preaching a sermon there, and by various other measures, they gradually broke it up. The demoralizing hula hula was forbidden to be performed, save at night, with closed doors, in presence of few spectators, and only by permission duly procured from the authorities and the payment of $10 for the same. There are few girls nowadays able to dance this ancient national dance in the highest perfection of the art. The missionaries have Christianized and educated all the natives. They all belong to the church, and there is not one of them above the age of 8 years, but can read and write with facility in the native tongue. It is the most universally educated race of people outside of China. They have any quantity of books, printed in the Kanaka language, and all the natives are fond of reading. They are inveterate churchgoers. Nothing can keep them away. All this ameliorating cultivation has at last built up in the native women a profound respect for chastity in other people. Perhaps that is enough to say on that head. The national sin will die out when the race does, but perhaps not earlier. But doubtless, this purifying is not far off when we reflect that contact with civilization and the whites has reduced the native population from 400,000, Captain Cook's estimate, to 55,000 in something over 80 years. Oh. Society is a queer medley in this notable missionary, whaling, and governmental center. If you get into conversation with a stranger and experience that natural desire to know what sort of ground you are treading on by finding out what manner of man your stranger is, strike out boldly and address him as captain. Watch him narrowly, and if you see by his countenance that you are on the wrong tack, ask him where he preaches. It is a safe bet that he is either a missionary or captain of a whaler. I am now personally acquainted with 72 captains and 96 missionaries. The captains and ministers form one half of the population. The third fourth is composed of common Kanakas and mercantile foreigners and their families. And the final fourth is made up of high officers of the Hawaiian government. And there are just about cats enough for 3 apiece all around. A solemn stranger met me in the suburbs the other day and said, "Good morning, your reverence. Preach in the stone church yonder, no doubt?" "No, I don't. I'm not a preacher." "Really? I beg your pardon, Captain. I trust you had a good season. How much oil?" "Oil? What do you take me for? I'm not a whaler." "Oh, I beg 1,000 pardons, your excellency. Major general in the household troops, no doubt? Minister of the Interior, likely? Secretary of War? First gentleman of the bedchamber? Commissioner of the Royal... Stuff! I'm no official. I'm not connected in any way with the government." "Bless my life. Then who the mischief are you? What the mischief are you? And how the mischief did you get here? And where in thunder did you come from?" "I'm only a private personage, an unassuming stranger, lately arrived from America." "No? Not a missionary? Not a whaler? Not a member of His Majesty's government? Not even Secretary of the Navy? Ah, heaven! It is too blissful to be true. Alas, I do but dream. And yet that noble, honest countenance, those oblique, ingenuous eyes, that massive head, incapable of anything. Your hand. Give me your hand, bright waif. Excuse these tears. For 16 weary years I have yearned for a moment like this, and..." Here his feelings were too much for him, and he swooned away. I pitied this poor creature from the bottom of my heart. I was deeply moved. I shed a few tears on him and kissed him for his mother. I then took what small change he had and shoved. Chapter 67. I still quote from my journal. "I found the national legislature to consist of half a dozen white men and some 30 or 40 natives. It was a dark assemblage. The nobles and ministers, about a dozen of them altogether, occupied the extreme left of the hall, with David Kalakaua, the king's chamberlain, and Prince William at the head. The president of the assembly, His Royal Highness, Mr. Kekua Naoa, since dead, and the vice president, the latter a white man, sat in the pulpit, if I may so term it. The president is the king's father. He is an erect, strongly built, massively featured, white-haired, tawny old gentleman of 80 years of age or thereabouts. He was simply but well dressed in a blue cloth coat and white vest, and white pantaloons, without spot, dust, or blemish upon them. He bears himself with a calm, stately dignity, and is a man of noble presence. He was a young man and a distinguished warrior under that terrific fighter, Kamehameha I, more than half a century ago. A knowledge of his career suggested some such thought as this. This man, naked as the day he was born, and war club and spear in hand, has charged at the head of a horde of savages against other hordes of savages more than a generation and a half ago, and reveled in slaughter and carnage, has worshipped wooden images on his devout knees, has seen hundreds of his race offered up in heathen temples as sacrifices to wooden idols, and at a time when no missionary's foot had ever pressed the soil, and he had never heard of the white man's God, has believed his enemy could secretly pray him to death, has seen the day in his childhood when it was a crime punishable by death for a man to eat with his wife, or for a plebeian to let his shadow fall upon the king. And now look at him, an educated Christian, neatly and handsomely dressed, a high-minded, elegant gentleman, a traveler in some degree, and one who has been the honored guest of royalty in Europe, a man practiced in holding the reins of an enlightened government, and well-versed in the politics of his country and in general, practical information. Look at him, sitting there presiding over the deliberations of a legislative body among whom are white men, a grave, dignified, statesmanlike personage, and as seemingly natural and fitted to the place as if he had been born in it and had never been out of it in his lifetime. How the experiences of this old man's eventful life shame the cheap inventions of romance. Kekua Naoa is not of the royal blood. He derives his princely rank from his wife, who was a daughter of Kamehameha the Great. Under other monarchies, the male line takes precedence of the female in tracing genealogies, but here the opposite is the case. The female line takes precedence. The reason for this is exceedingly sensible, and I recommend it to the aristocracy of Europe. They say it is easy to know who a man's mother was, but etc., etc. The Christianizing of the natives was hardly ever weakened. The Christianizing of the natives has hardly ever weakened. Let me try one more time. The Christianizing of the natives has hardly even weakened some of their barbarian superstitions, much less destroyed them. I have just referred to one of these. It is still a popular belief that if your enemy can get hold of any article belonging to you, he can get down on his knees over it and pray you to death. Therefore, many a native gives up and dies merely because he imagines that some enemy is putting him through a course of damaging prayer. This praying an individual to death seems absurd enough at a first glance, but then when we call to mind some of the pulpit efforts of certain of our own ministers, the thing looks plausible. In former times, among the islanders, not only a plurality of wives was customary, but a plurality of husbands likewise. Some native women of noble rank had as many as 6 husbands. A woman thus supplied did not reside with all her husbands at once, but lived several months with each in turn. An understood sign hung at her door during these months. When the sign was taken down, it meant next. In those days, woman was rigidly taught to know her place. Her place was to do all the work, take all the cuffs, provide all the food, and content herself with what was left after her lord had finished his dinner. She was not only forbidden by ancient law and under penalty of death to eat with her husband or enter a canoe, but was debarred, under the same penalty, from eating bananas, pineapples, oranges, and other choice fruits at any time or in any place. She had to confine herself pretty strictly to poi and hard work. These poor, ignorant heathens seem to have had a sort of groping idea of what came of women eating fruit in the Garden of Eden, and they did not choose to take any more chances. But the missionaries broke up this satisfactory arrangement of things. They liberated woman and made her the equal of man. The enemies had a romantic fashion of burying some of their children alive when the family became larger than necessary. The missionaries interfered in this matter too and stopped it. To this day, the natives are able to lie down and die whenever they want to, whether there is anything the matter with them or not. If a Kanaka takes a notion to die, that is the end of him. Nobody can persuade him to hold on. All the doctors in the world could not save him. A luxury which they enjoy more than anything else is a large funeral. If a person wants to get rid of a troublesome native, it is only necessary to promise him a fine funeral and name the hour, and he will be on hand to the minute. At least, his remains will. All the natives are Christians now, but many of them still desert to the great shark god for temporary succor in times of trouble. An eruption of the great volcano of Kilauea, or an earthquake, always brings a deal of latent loyalty to the great shark god to the surface. It is common report that the king, educated, cultivated, and refined Christian gentleman as he undoubtedly is, still turns to the idols of his fathers for help when disaster threatens. A planter caught a shark, and one of his Christianized natives testified his emancipation from the thrall of ancient superstition by assisting to dissect the shark after a fashion forbidden by his abandoned creed. But remorse shortly began to torture him. He grew moody and sought solitude, brooded over his sin, refused food, and finally said he must die and ought to die, for he had sinned against the great shark god and could never know peace any more. He was proof against persuasion and ridicule, and in the course of a day or two took to his bed and died, although he showed no symptoms of disease. His young daughter followed his lead and suffered a like fate within the week. Superstition is ingrained in the native blood and bone, and it is only natural that it should crop out in time of distress. Wherever one goes in the islands, he will find small piles of stones by the wayside, covered with leafy offerings, placed there by the natives to appease evil spirits or honor local deities belonging to the mythology of former days. In the rural districts of any of the islands, the traveler hourly comes upon parties of dusky maidens bathing in the streams or in the sea without any clothing on, and exhibiting no very intemperate zeal in the matter of hiding their nakedness. When the missionaries first took up their residence in Honolulu, the native women would pay their families frequent friendly visits, day by day, not even clothed with a blush. It was found a hard matter to convince them that this was rather indelicate. Finally, the missionaries provided them with long, loose calico robes, and that ended the difficulty. For the women would troop through the town, stark naked, with their robes folded under their arms, march to the missionary houses, and then proceed to dress. The natives soon manifested a strong proclivity for clothing, but it was shortly apparent that they only wanted it for grandeur. The missionaries imported a quantity of hats, bonnets, and other male and female wearing apparel, instituted a general distribution, and begged the people not to come to church naked next Sunday, as usual. And they did not. But the natural spirit of unselfishness led them to divide up with neighbors who were not at the distribution, and next Sabbath the poor preachers could hardly keep countenance before their vast congregation. In the midst of the reading of the hymn, a brown, stately dame would sweep up the aisle with a world of airs, with nothing in the world on but a stovepipe hat and a pair of cheap gloves. Another dame would follow, tricked out in a man's shirt, and nothing else. Another one would enter with a flourish, with simply the sleeves of a bright calico dress tied around her waist, and the rest of the garment dragging behind like a peacock's tail off duty. A stately buck Kanaka would stalk in with a woman's bonnet on, wrong side before, only this and nothing more. After him would strive his fellow, with the legs of a pair of pantaloons tied around his neck, the rest of his person untrammeled. In his rear would come another gentleman, simply gotten up in a fiery necktie and a striped vest. The poor creatures were beaming with complacency and wholly unconscious of any absurdity in their appearance. They gazed at each other with happy admiration, and it was plain to see that the young girls were taking note of what each other had on, as naturally as if they had always lived in the land of Bibles and knew what churches were made for. Here was the evidence of a dawning civilization. The spectacle which the congregation presented was so extraordinary, and withal so moving, that the missionaries found it difficult to keep to the text and go on with the services. And by, when the simple children of the sun began a general swapping of garments in open meeting and produced some irresistibly grotesque effects in the course of redressing, there was nothing for it but to cut the thing short with a benediction and dismiss the fantastic assemblage. In our country, children play keep house, and in the same high-sounding but miniature way, the grown folk here, with the poor little material of slender territory and meager population, play empire. There is His Royal Majesty the King, with the New York detective's income of $30,000 or $35,000 a year from the Royal Civil List and the Royal Domain. He lives in a 2-story frame palace. And there is the royal family, the customary hive of royal brothers, sisters, cousins, and other noble drones and vagrants usual to monarchy, all with a spoon in the national pap dish, and all bearing such titles as His or Her Royal Highness the Prince or Princess so-and-so. Few of them can carry their royal splendors far enough to ride in carriages, however. They sport the economical Kanaka horse, or hoof it, missionary phrase, with the plebeians. Then there is His Excellency, the Royal Chamberlain, a sinecure, for His Majesty dresses himself with his own hands, except when he is ruralizing at Waikiki, and then he requires no dressing. Next we have His Excellency the Commander-in-Chief of the Household Troops, whose forces consist of about the number of soldiers usually placed under a corporal in other lands. Next comes the royal steward and the grand equerry in waiting, high dignitaries with modest salaries and little to do. Then we have His Excellency the First Gentleman of the Bedchamber, an office as easy as it is magnificent. Next we come to His Excellency the Prime Minister, a renegade American from New Hampshire, all jaw, vanity, bombast, and ignorance, a lawyer of shyster caliber, a fraud by nature, a humble worshipper of the scepter above him, a reptile, never tired of sneering at the land of his birth or glorifying the 10-acre kingdom that has adopted him. Salary, $4,000 a year, vast consequence, and no prerequisites. Then we have His Excellency, the Imperial Minister of Finance, who handles $1 million of public money a year, sends in his annual budget with great ceremony, talks prodigiously of finance, suggests imposing schemes for paying off the national debt of $150,000, and does it all for $4,000 a year, an unimaginable glory. Next, we have His Excellency, the Minister of War, who holds sway over the royal armies. They consist of 230 uniformed Kanakas, mostly brigadier generals, and if the country ever gets into trouble with a foreign power, we shall probably hear from them. I knew an American whose copperplate visiting card bore this impressive legend, Lieutenant Colonel in the Royal Infantry. To say that he was proud of this distinction is stating it but tamely. The Minister of War has also in his charge some venerable swivels on Punch Bowl Hill, wherewith royal salutes are fired when foreign vessels of war enter the port. Next comes His Excellency the Minister of the Navy, a nabob who rules the royal fleet, a steam tug and a 60-ton schooner. And next comes His Grace the Lord Bishop of Honolulu, the chief dignitary of the established church. For when the American Presbyterian missionaries had completed the reduction of the nation to a compact condition of Christianity, native royalty stepped in and erected the grand dignity of an established Episcopal church over it, and imported a cheap, ready-made bishop from England to take charge. The chagrin of the missionaries has never been comprehensively expressed to this day, profanity not being admissible. Next comes His Excellency, the Minister of Public Instruction. Next, their excellencies, the governors of Oahu, Hawaii, etc., and after them a string of high sheriffs and other small fry too numerous for computation. Then there are their excellencies, the envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary of His Imperial Majesty the Emperor of the French, her British Majesty's minister, the minister resident of the United States, and some 6 or 8 representatives of other foreign nations, all with sounding titles, imposing dignity, and prodigious but economical state. Imagine all this grandeur in a playhouse kingdom whose population falls absolutely short of 60,000 souls. The people are so accustomed to 9-jointed titles and colossal magnates that a foreign prince makes very little more stir in Honolulu than a Western congressman does in New York. And let it be borne in mind that there is a strictly defined court costume of so stunning a nature that it would make the clown in a circus look tame and commonplace by comparison. And each Hawaiian official dignitary has a gorgeous, vari-colored, gold-laced uniform peculiar to his office. No 2 of them are alike, and it is hard to tell which one is the loudest. The king had a drawing room at stated intervals, like other monarchs, and when these varied uniforms congregate there, weak-eyed people have to contemplate the spectacle through smoked glass. Is there not a gratifying contrast between this latter-day exhibition and the one the ancestors of some of these magnates afforded the missionaries the Sunday after the old-time distribution of clothing? Behold what religion and civilization have wrought. Chapter 68 has him talking about a diagram. I'm just going to give you a little peek. Some of the words are printed sideways, so I will do my best to narrate how this is, so bear with me. Chapter 68. While I was in Honolulu, I witnessed the ceremonious funeral of the king's sister, Her Royal Highness the Princess Victoria. According to the royal custom, the remains had lain in state at the palace 30 days, watched day and night by a guard of honor. And during all that time, a great multitude of natives from the several islands had kept the palace grounds well crowded and had made the place a pandemonium every night with their howlings and wailings, beating of tom-toms, and dancing of the, at other times, forbidden hula by half-clad maidens to the music of songs of questionable decency chanted in honor of the deceased. The printed program of the funeral procession interested me at the time, and after what I have just said of Hawaiian grandiloquence in the matter of playing empire, I am persuaded that a perusal of it may interest the reader. After reading the long list of dignitaries, etc., and remembering the sparseness of the population, one is almost inclined to wonder where the material for that portion of the procession devoted to Hawaiian population generally is going to be procured. Undertaker. Royal School, Kauaiahau School, Roman Catholic School, Mi'aeme'e School, Honolulu Fire Department, Mechanics Benefit Union, Attending Physicians, Kuonohikis, Superintendents of the Crown Lands, Konohikis of the private lands of His Majesty, Konohikis of private lands of Her late Royal Highness. Governor of Oahu and Staff. Hulumanu, Military Company. Household Troops. The Prince of Hawaii's Own, Military Company. The King's Household Servants. Servants of Her late Royal Highness. Protestant Clergy. The Clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. His Lordship, Louis Maigret, the Right Reverend Bishop of Arathea, Vicar Apostol of the Hawaiian Islands. The Clergy of the Hawaiian Reformed Catholic Church. His Lordship, the Right Reverend Bishop of Honolulu. To the left of the hearse, Escort Hawaiian Cavalry, large kahilis, small kahilis, pallbearers. To the right of the hearse, Escort Hawaiian Cavalry, large kahilis, small kahilis, and pallbearers. And then after the hearse, Her Majesty Queen Emma's carriage, His Majesty's staff, carriage of Her late Royal Highness, carriage of Her Majesty the Queen Dowager, the King's Chancellor, Cabinet Ministers, His Excellency the Minister Resident of the United States, HIM's Commissioner, HBM's Acting Commissioner, Judges of Supreme Court, Privy Councilors, Members of Legislative Assembly, Consular Corps, Circuit Judges, Clerks of Government Departments, Members of the Bar, Collector General, Custom House Officers and Officers of the Customs, Marshal and Sheriffs of the different islands, King's Yeomanry, Foreign Residents, Ahahui Ka'ahumanu, Hawaiian population generally, Hawaiian Cavalry, Police Force. Then there's a star saying, ranks of long-handled mops made of gaudy feathers, sacred to royalty. They are stuck in the ground around the tomb and left there. Oh, sorry, that was the large kahilis. It means ranks of large-handled mops made of gaudy feathers, sacred to royalty. They are stuck in the ground around the tomb and left there. I resumed my journal at the point where the procession arrived at the royal mausoleum. As the procession filed through the gate, the military deployed handsomely to the right and left and formed an avenue through which the long column of mourners passed to the tomb. The coffin was borne through the door of the mausoleum, followed by the king and his chiefs, the great officers of the kingdom, foreign consuls, ambassadors, and distinguished guests, Burlingame and General Van Valkenburg. Several of the kahilis were then fastened to a framework in front of the tomb, there to remain until they decay and fall to pieces, or, forestalling this, until another scion of royalty dies. At this point of the proceedings, the multitude set up such a heartbroken wailing as I hope never to hear again. The soldiers fired 3 volleys of musketry, the wailing being previously silenced to permit of the guns being heard. His Highness Prince William, in a showy military uniform, the true prince, this, scion of the house overthrown by the present dynasty, he was formerly betrothed to the princess but was not allowed to marry her, stood guard and paced back and forth within the door. The privileged few who followed the coffin into the mausoleum remained some time, but the king soon came out and stood in the door and near one side of it. A stranger could have guessed his rank, although he was so simply and unpretentiously dressed, by the profound deference paid him by all persons in his vicinity, by seeing his high officers receive his quiet orders and suggestions with bowed and uncovered heads, and by observing how careful those persons who came out of the mausoleum were to avoid crowding him, although there was room enough in the doorway for a wagon to pass, for that matter. How respectfully they edged out sideways, scraping their backs against the wall, and always presenting a front view of their persons to His Majesty, and never putting their hats on until they were well out of the royal presence. He was dressed entirely in black, dress coat and silk hat, and looked rather democratic in the midst of the showy uniforms about him. On his breast he wore a large gold star, which was half hidden by the lapel of his coat. He remained at the door a half hour, and occasionally gave an order to the men who were erecting the kahilis before the tomb. He had the good taste to make one of them substitute black crepe for the ordinary hempen rope he was about to tie one of them to the framework with. Finally, he entered his carriage and drove away, and the populace shortly began to drop into his wake. While he was in view, there was but one man who attracted more attention than himself, and that was Harris, the Yankee Prime Minister. This feeble personage had crepe enough around his hat to express the grief of an entire nation, and as usual, he neglected no opportunity on making himself conspicuous and exciting the admiration of the simple Kanakas. Oh, noble ambition of this modern Richelieu! It is interesting to contrast the funeral ceremonies of the Princess Victoria with those of her noted ancestor, Kamehameha the Conqueror, who died 50 years ago, in 1819, the year before the first missionaries came. On the 8th of May, 1819, at the age of 66, he died, as he had lived, in the faith of his country. It was his misfortune not to have come in contact with men who could have rightly influenced his religious aspirations. Judged by his advantages and compared with the most eminent of his countrymen, he may be justly styled not only great, but good. To this day, his memory warms the heart and elevates the national feelings of Hawaiians. They are proud of their old warrior king. They love his name. His deeds form their historical age, and an enthusiasm everywhere prevails, shared even by foreigners who knew his worth, that constitutes the firmest pillar of the thrones of his dynasty. In lieu of human victims, the custom of that age, a sacrifice of 300 dogs attended his obsequies. No mean holocaust when their national value and the estimation in which they were held are considered. The bones of Kamehameha, after being kept for a while, were so carefully concealed that all knowledge of their final resting place is now lost. There was a proverb current among the common people that the bones of a cruel king could not be hid. They made fishhooks and arrows of them, upon which, in using them, they vented their abhorrence of his memory in bitter execrations. The account of the circumstances of his death, as written by the native historians, is full of minute detail, but there is scarcely a line of it which does not mention or illustrate some bygone custom of the country. In this respect, it is the most comprehensive document I have yet met with. I will quote it entire. When Kamehameha was dangerously sick and the priests were unable to cure him, they said, "Be of good courage and build a house for the god, his own private god or idol, that thou mayest recover." The chiefs corroborated this advice of the priests, and a place of worship was prepared for Kua'ili Moku and consecrated in the evening. They proposed also to the king, with a view to prolong his life, that human victims should be sacrificed to his deity, upon which the greater part of the people absconded through fear of death and concealed themselves in hiding places till the tabu, pronounced taboo, means prohibition. We have borrowed it, or sacred. The taboo was sometimes persistent, sometimes temporary, and the person or thing placed under taboo was for the time being sacred to the purpose for which it was set apart. In the above case, the victim selected under the taboo would be sacred to the sacrifice. So, the natives, they concealed themselves in hiding places till the taboo, in which destruction impended, was passed. It is doubtful whether Kamehameha approved of the plan of the chiefs and priests to sacrifice men, as he was known to say, "The men are sacred for the king," meaning that they were for the service of his successor. This information was derived from Liholiho, his son. After this, his sickness increased to such a degree that he had not strength to turn himself in his bed. When another season, consecrated for worship at the new temple, Heiau, arrived, he said to his son, Liholiho, "Go thou, and make supplication to thy God. I am not able to go, and will offer my prayers at home." When his devotions to his feathered god, Kukaili Moku, were concluded, a certain religiously disposed individual, who had a bird god, suggested to the king that through its influence his sickness might be removed. The name of this god was Pua. Its body was made of a bird, now eaten by the Hawaiians, and called in their language Alei. Kamehameha was willing that a trial should be made, and 2 houses were constructed to facilitate the experiment. But while dwelling in them, he became so weak as not to receive food. After lying there 3 days, his wives, children, and chiefs, perceiving that he was very low, returned him to his own home. In the evening he was carried to the eating house. It was deemed pollution to eat in the same hut a person slept in. The fact that the patient was dying could not modify the rigid etiquette. In the evening he was carried to the eating house, where he took a little food in his mouth which he did not swallow, also a cup of water. The chiefs requested him to give them his counsel, but he made no reply and was carried back to the dwelling house. But when near midnight, 10 o'clock perhaps, he was carried again to the place to eat, but as before he merely tasted of what was presented to him. Then Kaiki-o-Ewa addressed him thus: "Here we all are, your younger brethren, your son Liho-Liho, and your foreigner. Impart to us your dying charge, that Liho-Liho and Ka'ahumanu may hear." Then Kamehameha inquired, "What do you say?" Kaiki-o-Ewa replied, "Your counsels for us." He then said, "Move on in my good way," and he could proceed no further. The foreigner, Mr. Young, embraced and kissed him. Hoapili also embraced him, whispering something in his ear, after which he was taken back to the house. About 12 he was carried once more to the house for eating, into which his head entered, while his body was in the dwelling house immediately adjoining. It should be remarked that this frequent carrying of a sick chief from one house to another resulted from the taboo system then in force. There were at that time 6 huts, connected with an establishment. One was for worship, one for the men to eat in, an eating house for the women, a house to sleep in, a house in which to manufacture kapa, native cloth, and one where, at certain intervals, the women might dwell in seclusion. The sick was once more taken to his home, when he expired. This was at 2 o'clock, a circumstance from which Lele-Io-Hoku derived his name. As he breathed his last, Kala'imoku came to the eating house to order those in it to go out. There were 2 aged persons thus directed to depart. One went, the other remained on account of love to the king, by whom he had formerly been kindly sustained. The children also were sent away. Then Kala'imoku came to the house, and the chiefs had a consultation. One of them spoke thus: "This is my thought. We will eat him raw." This sounds suspicious in view of the fact that all Sandwich Island historians, white and black, protest that cannibalism never existed in the islands. However, since they only propose to eat him raw, we won't count that. But it would certainly have been cannibalism if they had cooked him. Mark Twain. Ka'ahumanu, one of the dead king's widows, replied, "Perhaps his body is not at our disposal. That is more properly with his successor. Our part in him, his breath, has departed. His remains will be disposed of by Liho-Liho." After this conversation, the body was taken into the consecrated house for the performance of the proper rites by the priest and the new king. The name of this ceremony is uko, and when the sacred hog was baked, the priest offered it to the dead body, and it became a god, the king at the same time repeating the customary prayers. Then the priest, addressing himself to the king and chiefs, said, "I will now make known to you the rules to be observed respecting persons to be sacrificed on the burial of this body. If you obtain 1 man before the corpse is removed, 1 will be sufficient. But after it leaves this house, 4 will be required. If delayed until we carry the corpse to the grave, there must be 10. But after it is deposited in the grave, there must be 15. Tomorrow morning, there will be a taboo, and if the sacrifice be delayed until that time, 40 men must die." Then the high priest, Hewa, inquired of the chiefs, "Where shall be the residence of King Liho-Liho?" They replied, "Where indeed? You of all men ought to know." Then the priest observed, "There are 2 suitable places. One is Ka'u, the other is Kohala." The chiefs preferred the latter, as it was more thickly inhabited. The priest added, "These are proper places for the king's residence, but he must not remain in Kona, for it is polluted." This was agreed to. It was now break of day. As he was being carried to the place of burial, the people perceived that their king was dead, and they wailed. When the corpse was removed from the house to the tomb, a distance of 1 chain, the procession was met by a certain man who was ardently attached to the deceased. He leapt upon the chiefs who were carrying the king's body. He desired to die with him on account of his love. The chiefs drove him away. He persisted in making numerous attempts, which were unavailing. Kalaimoka also had it in his heart to die with him, but was prevented by Hukio. The morning following Kamehameha's death, Liholiho and his train departed for Kohala, according to the suggestions of the priest, to avoid the defilement occasioned by the dead. At this time, if a chief died, the land was polluted, and the heirs sought a residence in another part of the country until the corpse was dissected and the bones tied in a bundle, which being done, the season of defilement terminated. If the deceased were not a chief, the house only was defiled, which became pure again on the burial of the body. Such were the laws on this subject. On the morning on which Liholiho sailed in his canoe for Kohala, the chiefs and people mourned after their manner on occasion of a chief's death, conducting themselves like madmen and like beasts. Their conduct was such as to forbid description. The priests also put into action the sorcery apparatus, that the person who had prayed the king to death might die, for it was not believed that Kamehameha's departure was the effect either of sickness or old age. When the sorcerers set up by their fireplaces stick with a strip of kapa flying at the top, the chief Keeaumoku, Ka'ahuma'un's brother, came in a state of intoxication and broke the flagstaff of the sorcerers, from which it was inferred that Ka'ahumanu and her friends had been instrumental in the king's death. On this account, they were subjected to abuse. You have the contrast now, and a strange one it is. This great queen, Ka'ahumanu, who was subjected to abuse during the frightful orgies that followed the king's death, in accordance with ancient custom, afterward became a devout Christian and a steadfast and powerful friend of the missionaries. Dogs were, and still are, reared and fattened for food by the natives, hence the reference to their value in one of the above paragraphs. 40 years ago, it was the custom in the islands to suspend all law for a certain number of days after the death of a royal personage, and then a saturnalia ensued which one may picture to himself after a fashion, but not in the full horror of the reality. The people shaved their heads, knocked out a tooth or two, plucked out an eye sometimes, cut, bruised, mutilated, or burned their flesh, got drunk, burned each other's huts, maimed or murdered one another according to the caprice of the moment, and both sexes gave themselves up to brutal and unbridled licentiousness. And after it all came a torpor from which the nation slowly emerged, bewildered and dazed, as if from a hideous, half-remembered nightmare. They were not the salt of the earth, those gentle children of the sun. The natives still keep up an old custom of theirs which cannot be comforting to an invalid. When they think a sick friend is going to die, a couple of dozen neighbors surround his hut and keep up a deafening, wailing night and day till he either dies or gets well. No doubt this arrangement has helped many a subject to a shroud before his appointed time. They surround a hut and wail in the same heartbroken way when its occupant returns from a journey. This is their dismal idea of a welcome. A very little of it would go a great way with many of us. That concludes today's reading from Roughing It by Mark Twain. Thank you very much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We have, as I said, just 3 more days of our read-along together to conclude Roughing It. I will also open up the invitation for our tea party next Monday to discuss our thoughts about the book. And so I look forward to seeing you then. And if you're able to attend, please do RSVP for it so I can know how many folks to expect. All right. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, friends.